So I went back onto the World of Tanks patch 9.9 test server in order to test out machines like the new Japanese Tiger, the heavy tank number 6, and the new German Tier 7 tank destroyer, the Kanonen Jagdpanzer. Unfortunately, there's only so many games like this you can get into before you start to lose your will to live. And so I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to be getting into Tier 10 matches all the time, or Tier 8 matches if you're in the heavy tank number 6, and if everybody's going to be firing nothing but gold ammunition at me, well, I may as well, A, be in a scout tank if I'm going to get into Tier 10 matches, and be in something that doesn't have any armour anyway, so it doesn't matter what kind of ammunition anybody's firing at me. This sounds like a job for the new German Tier 7 light tank, the Spähpanzer 1C. Believe it or not, this little thing is not a paper tank. Well, technically it's not a paper tank. It did exist in prototype form. It was a development of a vehicle known as the Schützenpanzer Kurz, which itself was a development of a French-designed Hotchkiss armoured fighting vehicle. The basic idea with this little machine was to follow in the footsteps of the very successful German Puma armoured cars of World War II, where the basic idea with those was to take as lightly armoured and mobile a vehicle as possible and strap the biggest gun onto it that it could carry, and they had sort of succeeded in that respect, to a certain degree. It's certainly got a big gun. That's a 90mm cannon, and it's also available in auto-loader flavour. As far as lightly armoured goes, well, it's definitely got that covered as well. This thing actually has less armour than the ELC AMX. It's 10mm everywhere, except for the front of the turret, where it's, wait for it, a whopping 15mm. Yeah, this thing isn't going to bounce shots from anything. Unfortunately, then we come to the mobility, and it's certainly not slow. It's got the real top speed of 58 kilometers per hour, but this is one of those machines where if you're looking for 100% historical accuracy, you should probably be playing another game. Because whereas the real thing weighed 6.5 tons and had a 200 horsepower engine, giving it a power to weight ratio of 30 horsepower per ton, which makes it blisteringly quick. It doesn't have anything even remotely close to that here in World of Tanks. In World of Tanks it weighs just short of 10 tons and it only has a 195 horsepower engine, which gives it a power to weight ratio of just a fraction over 20 horsepower per ton. Now that's not terrible, it could be worse. It could be the AMX 1375 for example, which has an even worse power to weight ratio even after 2 engine upgrades. But it's only just better than the AMX 1375 and it falls far behind the other Tier 7 light tanks. The LTTB for example has 30 horsepower per ton, in fact it has almost 31. And it's 10 kilometers per hour faster, and it's got better armour. The Walker Bulldog, also at Tier 7, it doesn't have much of a better power to weight ratio, but it is better, and it'll do 72.4 kilometers per hour. A lot of people feel that the Chinese light tanks have been left behind in the dust by the introduction of the new Tier 7 and Tier 8 light tanks, but the WZ-131 has got better armour, it's faster, it's got a better power to weight ratio, and it's got a bigger gun. So where does that leave the Spähpanzer 1C? Well, at least it can always say it's not the AMX 1375. But at the end of the day, being able to say, hey, at least we're not the AMX 1375 isn't really much of a selling point. So, well, what is really good about the Spähpanzer 1C? Surely it's the gun. I mean, that was the whole point of the machine, to fit as big a gun as possible onto as small and light a chassis as possible. So, let's take a look at the gun. The gun on this little tank is a 90mm anti-tank gun, and it comes in 2 flavours, auto-loading and non-autoloading. And the autoloader is a massive turd of a gun. It is absolutely terrible in just about every category. For a start, it only has 3 shots in the magazine, and it takes 3 seconds to fire each shot. You then spend 20 seconds reloading a 3-shot magazine. Now the AMX 1375 might not be that good, but it actually loads 6 shots faster than the Spähpanzer loads 3. And it fires them faster as well. I'm tempted to write this gun off as a bad investment altogether, but there are going to be circumstances where you're going to want to use it, particularly, for example, when you've tracked down the enemy artillery and you need to get them killed quick before they either shotgun you or their friends turn up. But here's the problem. It only has 0.38 accuracy in the autoloader version of this 90mm gun, and you combine that with a 3-shot magazine means you just cannot afford to miss, so you have to stop and aim. And, well, you all know how dangerous that is when you're in a light tank, particularly a Tier 7 light tank that has less health than any of the other Tier 7 light tanks. And the 2.4 second aiming time would be alright if you were in a medium tank, and it'd be fantastic if you were in a heavy. But when it's taking you 3 seconds, a second longer than any of the other Tier 7 autoloaders to put each shot into the target, and you have to stay still and aim in order to hit, because you can't afford to miss because you've only got 3 shots, well, that 2.4 seconds feels like an absolute eternity. I really just don't like this autoloading version of the 90mm gun. There are just too many drawbacks for it to be useful in all but the most extreme of circumstances. The non-autoloading version of the gun, however, well, it's more accurate, it's got a better aiming time, but it's got a really slow rate of fire, and that of course is the price that you pay for putting such a big gun into such a small tank. It's also worth pointing out that the high explosive ammunition on this thing is terrible. It only has 45mm of penetration, and remember this is a Tier 7 light tank, so it's going to get into Tier 8, 9 and Tier 10 games a lot. And the kind of artillery, for example, that you're going to be tempted to use this high explosive ammunition on to reduce the amount of time you're sitting there shooting at the artillery so you can get the hell out of there before his friends turn up, well, 45mm of penetration just is not going to cut it. You're going to be better off using the armor piercing. So what we have here is a brand new Tier 7 light tank that has the worst armor of any of the Tier 7 light tanks. It is not nearly as quick as it should be. It has the worst power to weight ratio of any of the non-premium Tier 7 light tanks, with the exception of the Apex 1375. It has an absolute disaster of a 90mm autoloading gun. The non-autoloading gun isn't bad, but it has a very disappointing rate of fire. There is no real category in which this tank stands apart from its other peers at Tier 7, which is a bit of a disappointment because this tank replaces the Avklaring's Panzer, which didn't have a lot of fans, but those people that did like it liked it for two very good reasons. One, you could fit a derp gun onto it, a 105mm howitzer, and two, it was heavy and well armoured for a light tank, and it was very quick. So any artillery, for example, that you couldn't one-shot with the derp gun, you could always ram to death. The Avklaring's Panzer had character. This little thing, it just doesn't stand out in any way, shape or form whatsoever. Well, that's not exactly 100% true. There is actually one area in which this tank excels over all of its other competitors at Tier 7, and that's to do with the module health of the suspension. The tracks on this tank tend to stay on. This tank has about 10% more module health on its suspension than any of the other Tier 7 light tanks, which means you can take the kind of hair-raising jumps in this tank that would just rip the tracks off any of the other Tier 7 lights, and this little thing just keeps on rolling. But other than that, well, it's kind of disappointing. And that really kind of sums the tank up. I mean, it's not bad, it's just disappointing. A lot of the Chinese light tank drivers in particular, drivers of the WZ131 and the WZ132, were very disappointed when the new Tier 7 and 8 light tanks were brought out, because they, and justifiably, felt that they'd been kind of neglected. Suddenly their little tanks weren't special anymore. But that didn't mean that the WZ131 and the WZ132 became bad tanks overnight. They weren't. They hadn't changed at all. They were still good tanks. They weren't quite as good as some of the newer kids on the block. And that's what's disappointing as well about the Spähpanzer 1C. Nevertheless, I have had a good game in it, and this was it. It was a Tier 10 match, obviously, on Derpenberg. To be completely fair, I couldn't have gotten the result in this match that I did if I'd had a bad team, but that's the curse of light tank drivers everywhere. There's only so much you can do in a light tank. You can light up the targets, but if your team refused to shoot them, well, there's only so much carrying you can do in one of these tiny little machines, particularly a machine like the Spähpanzer 1C, that only has 10mm of armour and 880 health, and is constantly getting into Tier 10 games, because it's a scout tank and gets scout matchmaking. Hell, this tank would get obliterated in a Tier 7 game. Seriously, the ELC AMX has got more armour than this thing. But, well, light tank drivers will tell you it's not about the armour, it's about how you use it. In this match, I am very much going to be shooting at targets of opportunity and passive scouting. 58km/h top speed, this thing is just not fast enough to go active scouting in a way that you can in a Walker Bulldog or an LTTB. I've knocked over a tree at the top of that hill to provide a little bit more cover, as well as to not block my line of sight. I'm attempting to spot enemy tanks as they come around the corner of the castle up here. There's a Foch 155 with me, so I've got some firepower. There's an enemy object 140 just on the other side of this ridge, and I do have to be very careful. I do not let that guy get within 50 meters of me, or he will automatically detect me. There he is down there, regardless of any kind of concealment. One of our Waffenträger E100s has just team killed our T71, although he does apologise for it, and I do believe it was an accident. It's not your standard test server game here where everybody's team killing everybody else. So I'm passive spotting for the team here, although I'm not entirely sure that's the right way to play this machine, because it does have a 90mm gun, and I think this is the match where I think I finally figured out the right way to play this little tank. I took a shot at that retreating Kanonen Jagdpanzer, and then immediately pulled back, waited a couple of seconds, and then moved back up to my spotting position. Now, I didn't know that I'd been spotted. I'm playing without the benefit of the sixth sense here, but when you're in a machine that has 880 health, you're in a tier 10 game and you only have 10mm of armor, just assume you've been spotted every time you fire the gun and react accordingly. So I do think this is the way that you play the Spähpanzer 1C. It's not really passive scouting in the traditional sense, because I'm actually shooting at these targets, and you definitely can't go active scouting in this machine. It's just not fast enough, and it doesn't have the power to weight ratio. But that 90mm gun with its 7 to 8 second reload, it's just long enough for me to pop up, take repeated shots at this Foch 155 for example, and then pull back. And in the 5 seconds it takes, if I had been spotted, for me to disappear from the radar, well, I have to wait that long for the gun to reload anyway. So it's more of an opportunity target taker. Like, well, look at this guy scuttling for cover. I'm going to get you, little TD. I'm going to get you, little TD. Actually, I don't get him. I thought I had. There he is. I fired, but no, somebody else got the kill. Ah well, never mind. But it works. And you can do this in a way that you just can't do in a machine like the LTTB, even though on paper the LTTB is just a better tank in every single category. It can't do this because it just does not have the gun depression. And this non-autoloading 90mm gun is definitely the best gun to be using, particularly in this kind of situation. Imagine if I did have that 3-shot autoloader. Remember, it's 3 seconds between each shot, and then you've got to pull back and wait 20 seconds to reload it. The AMX 1375 has a 6-shot magazine, and it reloads in 16 seconds. It just doesn't make sense. But it is what it is. Let's say, what we got down here? Big old E100. No. T62A, all the way over there. Okay. If I was using the autoloading gun, I would be tempted to stay up there and spend 6 seconds putting all 3 shots into that T62. And I guarantee you, somebody would put a 150mm cannon shell into me while I was doing it. When you're using the single shotgun, you just don't have that temptation. Oh look, I just killed an E100. It was a complete kill steal, but that's not the point. I killed an E100, and I'm in a 6.5 ton tank. And I think that's the first shot I've fired this game that didn't do damage. All they have left is the artillery, and well, you know what he's going to do, don't you? Test server, live server, some things never change. Batchat 15558, we know he's up there. And any second now, I'm all swiggity swooty, I'm going to get me some artillery booty, but no, he's a scumbag. And what do scumbags do when the last one's left alive? There he goes, he's just drowned himself. So, the Spähpanzer 1C. It is a disappointing tank. It's not as quick as it should be. The 90mm autoloader is an utter disaster of a gun, but that's alright. 2,000 damage done in a tier 10 match, and top of the team on experience earned. And there, as you can see, the accidental team killer actually did a pretty good job in his Waffenträger E100. Not as much spotting damage as I thought I'd had. I was being a little bit too cautious in my spotting on the top of that ridge, but I'm certainly not complaining about that result in a Tier 7 light tank and a Tier 10 match, particularly on the test server. And I do feel that that's the way that you should be playing this tank, or at least it's the only way I've had any success driving this tank. I've tried active scouting in this tank, zipping around the battlefield at 58 kilometers per hour just isn't fast enough. And with its lousy power to weight ratio, you hit a dip in the ground, and well, yeah, sure, the suspension stays on, but the tank slows right down, and you just get killed. It is a good passive scout. 400 meter view range, very, very good as the Walker Bulldog, but that's just wasting the potential of the gun. You do have a 90mm gun on this thing. Don't use the autoloader, it's terrible, but the regular, non-autoloading 90mm gun, yes, it does have a kind of a slow reload, but if you are taking shots at targets of opportunity, as I did in that replay, you're going to want to pull back anyway, and you're going to have to pull back for at least 5 seconds to ensure that you disappear from the enemy team's radar. And it takes you that long to reload the gun anyway. So that, I do feel, is the way that you should be driving this little tank. Play it as a passive scout, but take every shot possible at targets of opportunity while you're doing it. It's not a great tank by any stretch of the imagination, and it certainly doesn't have the character of the Aufklärungs Panzer, but it's not a terrible tank either. And providing you have the kind of team that supports the playstyle that you have to use to be effective in this machine, and that is by no means guaranteed, but that's the same for light tank drivers everywhere, then you can get good results in the Spähpanzer 1C. It just has a very, very unfortunate abbreviation. I mean, SPIC? Seriously? Seriously, does nobody at World of Tanks run these things through localization? I mean, you know, there was no way I was going to go through an entire review of this tank without making some sort of comment about the abbreviation. SPIC. I mean, come on. For those of you who are scratching your heads in puzzlement to, what do you mean, SPIC? What does SPIC mean? A SPIC is a very, very offensive term used to describe somebody of Spanish ancestry, particularly Mexicans. Where's it all going to end? Coming up in the next patch of World of Tanks, a brand new German premium tank, the Nebelwerfer Mark I Großtraktor, and I'll leave it up to you to figure out what the abbreviation on that one's going to be. I mean, seriously, World of Tanks, have a word with yourself. Anyway, that's it for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time. SPIC, seriously.